Good evening. I'm Jordana Balkin, a professor of history here at the University of Washington, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you for our final part of the 2014 History Lecture Series. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I would like to welcome those here in the audience on the main floor and also in the balcony. I would also like to welcome those who are watching in the nearby overflow room and those watching the subsequent broadcast on UW TV. We are very excited to share this sold-out series with all of you. As tonight is the last lecture in our 2014 series, I'd like, on behalf of the UW Department of History faculty, to say a few thank yous. First, I'd like to thank all of the staff at the UW Alumni Association and in the Department of History who worked over many weeks and many months to organize this series. In particular, I'd like to thank Ellen Whitlock Baker and Matt Erickson for going so far beyond the call of duty to ensure that all aspects of the series proceeded as smoothly as possible. We will soon begin planning our next year's series, so please look for these announcements in mailings and email messages. A reminder about the format for tonight's lecture. Our lecturer, John Toews, will speak for about 60 minutes. He will then answer questions from the audience for another 20 minutes or so. There will be no intermission between the lecture and the question and answer portion. So instead, after a brief pause, we will proceed directly to the question and answer period. If you'd like to ask a question, please write it on one of the pieces of paper that you might have picked up on the way in. Towards the end of the lecture, you may pass your questions towards the end of the aisle, where we'll collect them, and then we'll share as many as possible with the lecturer. I'd also ask now that if you haven't done so already, please turn off your cell phones and other devices so that we can proceed interruption-free back to the early 20th century. Tonight's lecturer, Professor John Toews, has been at the University of Washington since 1979. He has held many distinguished positions here, including serving for 30 years as the director and chair of the Innovative Comparative History of Ideas program, which I think is one of the true gems of our undergraduate programs. And it is the second largest major in the humanities after English. Professor Toews has also been a MacArthur Fellow, and in an honor that I think is particularly relevant to this lecture series, he was the Alumni Distinguished Professor in the College of Arts and Sciences from 2006 to 2007, and that gave him lifetime honorary alumnus status. Currently, he is the Geoff Hanauer Distinguished University Professor for Western Civilization in the College of Arts and Sciences. Professor Toews has published widely on aspects of 19th century German intellectual culture, the history and historiography of psychoanalysis, and the philosophy of history. His wonderful book, Becoming Historical, which was published with Cambridge in 2004, won the Hans Rosenberg Book Prize from the American Historical Association. He is working now on a study of the problem of autonomy and cultural identity in Sigmund Freud's thinking before the First World War. Tonight, he will be speaking on cultural death and radical hope. Please welcome Professor John Toews.
Thank you, Jordana, for the introduction. And thank you as well for your lecture, which together with the talks by Ray Jonas and Devin Narr have taught me a great deal about the historical significance and context of the Great War. And thank you to the History Department and to the Alumni Association for setting up this series, and inadvertently, I am sure, forcing me to spend weeks thinking about death while I was officially on post-operative medical leave. Let me begin by briefly setting up the problem that shaped my thinking for this talk with two pictures and a quotation. The pictures are by the British painter Paul Nash, completed in 1918 and based on sketches from his time on the Western Front in 1916 and 1917. They provide two contrasting images of no man's land between the trenches. The one on the left is entitled The Void, although it depicts a scene full of the rubble of the machinery of destruction. The one on the right, entitled We Are Making a New World, presents no man's land as an empty, barren field of possibility, gradually beginning to glow with the rising sun. By 1918, I suspect that Nash meant the title of this second painting in an ironic sense. Even after taking this possibility into account, however, the question remains, how should we interpret the relationship between absolute destruction and the hope for the creation of a new world from a ground zero in which all things seem possible? This question is also present in this quotation from the prophetic introductory chapter of Henri Barbusse's Le Feu, Under Fire, although I like just fire better because that seems to me what it's really about. The first warfront novel by a participant, which was published in 1916 and attained significant literary recognition and even mass popularity before the end of the war. I quote, "The streaming plain, seamed and seared with long parallel canals and scooped into water holes, is an immensity, and these castaways who strive to exhume themselves from it are legion. But the 30 million slaves hurled upon one another in the mud of war by guilt and error uplift their human faces and reveal at last a burgeoning will. The future is in the hands of these slaves, and it is clearly certain that the alliance to be cemented someday by those whose number and whose misery alike are infinite will transform the world." The term cultural death has an ambivalent meaning, and I would like to use it in both of the most obvious senses that we could ascribe to it. First of all, it suggests that the experience of human mortality is shaped within historical time and cultural space. Death is universal as the indicator of our mortality and defines our lived existence as finite natural beings, but there are historical and cultural differences in the experience of this common fate. We all die, but not all in the same way. As individual persons, we are shaped by the totality of relationships that constitute our identity, and thus the way we die and what we leave behind is historically particular and framed by the culture in which it occurs. But cultural death can also mean the death of culture, the collapse of the network of beliefs, linguistic codes, rituals, and images that give meaning and purpose to individual lives and thus also to individual deaths. And this second meaning is related to the first meaning of cultural death in important ways. Killing and dying receive their significance from the life of the culture within which they occur. Historical death is framed by cultural life, but what happens when culture dies? When death is experienced as meaningless? World War I is often also seen as a significant moment in the collapse, or at least fragmentation, of the traditional meaning systems of Western culture. Not only the inherited religious framework of the Judeo-Christian tradition, but also the foundational grounding of Western humanism in nature and history. The thinker usually recognized as the most influential diagnostician of this death in its three primary forms, the death of God, the death of man, and the end of history, as well as of its potential consequences, is the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, a 19th century thinker who experienced a complete mental breakdown in 1890 and died in 1900, which is why I have two biographical photographs of the two phases of his life. But as a cultural reality, Nietzsche did not die, of course, in 1890 or in 1900, which I have tried to suggest by the framing of this quotation. On the left is a sculpture by the modernist painter Otto Dix, completed in the summer of 1914, just before he himself volunteered at the age of 23 to fight with the German army. It is a work that he saw as a sign of discipleship and his own deep identification with Nietzsche's thought. On the right is a portrait completed a few years earlier by a leading member of an older generation of modernist artists, the Norwegian painter Edvard Munch, who painted this portrait while he was in Berlin in 1906 and 1907. And between them, we can imagine them reading it in their Nietzschean personas. The Nietzsche text most quoted in 1914 to show that he really did have a clear premonition of the emerging cultural catastrophe. I have a little aside here, which I kept out, but now I have to tell you about it. I can't help mentioning that Gavrilo Princip, the young Serb who assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo on July 28, 1914, thus triggering the sequence of events that led to the onset of the war a month later, was an ardent Nietzschean. And it was said that the meetings of the Black Hand, of which he was a member, began with readings from Nietzsche's Ecce Homo. Well, let's read the quotation. "I know my fate. One day my name will be associated with the memory of something tremendous, a crisis without equal on earth, the most profound collision of conscience, a decision that was conjured up against everything that had been believed, demanded, hallowed so far. I am no man, I am dynamite. I am necessarily also the man of calamity, for when truth enters into a fight with the lies of millennia, we shall have upheavals, a convulsion of earthquakes, a moving of mountains and valleys, the like of which has never been dreamed of. The concept of politics will have merged entirely with the war of the spirit. All power structures of the old society will have been exploded. All of them are based on lies. There will be wars the like of which have never been seen on earth. It is only beginning with me that the earth knows great politics." So what are the historically specific characteristics defining death in the Great War? Well, I shouldn't have done that. First of all, you have to be tolerant about my ability with this thing. First of all, of course, there are the sheer numbers, the quantitative mass of death that occurred within the specific space and time of the first major war fought under the conditions of mass mobilization and advanced technical organization and industrial production. Even 100 years later, and after the devastation of World War II, it is difficult to comprehend a total of 9 million deaths, 37 million casualties, and 65 million mobilized soldiers. Now, although the recent commemoration of 900,000 British Great War deaths in the field of ceramic poppies surrounding the Tower of London overwhelmed visitors with its suggestions of a river or a flood of blood, the number and percentage of casualties and deaths among mobilized troops were actually greater in the continental countries. Today, I will focus most of my analysis on Germany, a country that with over 2 million war deaths and 7 million total casualties certainly experienced the phenomena of mass death in a particularly intense fashion. It is also important to remember that war death in the era of mass mobilization affected most those who were in specific generational cohorts. For Germany, the number of men who were between the ages of 19 and 22 in 1914 was reduced by 37%. Mass death in World War I decimated specific generations, but at the same time, it was socially and geographically pervasive. The cohort of the dead came not primarily from professional soldiers, but encompassed a population that spanned social classes and ethnic and regional differences, including all of the many dimensions of the mass public recently incorporated into the networks of civil society that had emerged in the major European states during the long 19th century. And you may remember Ray Jonas talked a little bit about this in the first lecture. More particularly, it included the educated professional classes who had not traditionally participated in military combat, and especially that part of the educated class involved in the creation of and dissemination of the language and images of public meaning. Educators, writers, and artists were themselves participants in the war death experience and flooded the public world with their representations in ways not imagined in previous wars, leaving to posterity some of the most striking images of war death ever created. The sheer quantitative mass and distribution of war death in World War I was perhaps enough to change the very nature of the death experience. But these factors were also connected to a qualitative transformation of death in war. Increasingly, war death was experienced as impersonal, mechanical, industrialized slaughter. In this war, almost 60% of the deaths were the result of artillery shelling and other explosive projectiles. Death came out of the air, not man to man, but from a distance, randomly and anonymously. The technology and organization of industrial production, originally designed for the efficient production of goods, meant to enhance the quality of life, became a means for the efficient production of death. Mass armies of conscripts and volunteers marched to their destruction with all the organized precision that industrial capitalism had applied to the factory. The machine age had produced the machine gun, the explosive artillery shell, flamethrowers, and poison gas that turned the individual soldier into a passive victim. transforming traditional ideals of heroic action into a new war ideal of steely-nerved, stoic endurance. The abstract, impersonal nature of machine warfare often made it seem that the war itself, rather than any particular battlefield foe or human enemy, was the agent of destruction. The spectacle of brutally dismembered bodies crawling with rats and maggots and often indistinguishable from other debris in the landscape of death that was no man's land are signature passages in many of the witness testimonies from the soldiers at the front, creating a surrealistic collage whose meaning often seemed indecipherable. Let's return for a moment to Otto Dix, probably the most prolific painter. He was the person who did the Nietzsche sculpture, right, when he's at the age of 23. Probably the most prolific painter of the war as a death experience. After 6 months of military training, Dix served as an artillery specialist and then a machine gunner on both the Western and Eastern fronts until the end of the war. These two etchings are from a series of 50 entitled simply War, which he finally published and put on display in 1924. The next one is as a result of his continuing work on the same themes. You can see, especially in terms of the middle panel, the picture of the trench, which is a picture that he worked on over and over again in the 1920s, in the traditional form of an altarpiece, but with a content that seemed to mock and erase the traditional religious meaning of death and resurrection. You can read it, you know, I'm not an expert on this, it's just, I found it a little bit overwhelming. All I can see is potentialities in this relationship to things like the Isenheim altarpiece, which it is, you know, sort of copying in many ways. Is there's that one panel on the far left which actually shows Otto Dix himself dragging a wounded or perhaps dead comrade out of the battlefield. And then in the predella on the bottom, which would traditionally have Christ's body being washed before the resurrection by perhaps Mary or somebody like that, there are these, I don't know, sleeping or dead soldiers, but to me at least with very little sense or hope of resurrection. And are they, or does it seem that they're simply destined for oblivion? It was the grotesque and anonymous quality of individual death, as well as the sheer horror of mass death, that made the question of the meaning of death so critical. How could one find meaning for the human soul, the center of a purposeful personal life that had once inhabited these rotting corpses in the midst of this orgy of destruction? How could such death be transformed into a meaningful sacrifice for some larger cultural purpose? Cultural death would imply the collapse of the possibility of such meaning. It is one of the striking elements of the Great War that it began in August 1914 with a great outburst of public belief that war would not only sustain, but revive, and in some cases actually produce, a vibrant cultural life. War would give life meaning by affirming the truth that mortal individuals attain immortality by sacrificing their lives for the public good. The distinctive element in such claims about sacrificial death in 1914 was that culture was defined overwhelmingly as the culture of the nation, as a subjective identification of individuals inhabiting a particular civic space, as a community of souls, or spirit, defined not just by a common set of rules and shared system of political authority, but by a common internalized commitment about what made life worth living and thus worth dying for. Whatever the specific causes that brought the onset of hostilities in August 1914, the war was almost immediately experienced by many citizens, and especially in Germany, as a culture war, as a war defined by the opposition of national communities of purpose and meaning. This did not necessarily mean that the other older frameworks for giving significance to war death were simply abandoned. Families continued to mourn personal losses through acts of individual memorialization, and the traditional languages of religion and universal secular humanism did not simply vanish. But such traditional dimensions of a cultural life that gave meaning to individual death were increasingly absorbed into the framework and language of national life, progress, vitality, and especially power. The nationalist fervor that supported the decision to engage in a war of nations in August 1914 was most intense and significant in Germany. In all of the participating countries, the spirit of 1914 articulated a desire to overcome internal divisions with a commitment to national unity. to create some kind of common will among contending factions in which everyone affirmed their primary identification with the nation. National identity absorbed without erasing more traditional collective and religious identifications, loyalty to dynastic leaders, honor to kinship and family, defense of the homeland, were all contained within it. National identity was primarily a subjective reality, a community of feeling that left existing inequalities of status, wealth, and power in place, although it did lead to a temporary dampening of organized political conflict on class and religious differences in the negotiated truces of the German civil peace and the French Sacred Union. The Schlossplatz in Berlin burst into pandemonium, captured here both in contemporary photographs and the much more interesting sketch by the modernist painter George Gross, when the Kaiser stated on August 1st, 1914, that from this point forward, all parties cease and we are all brothers. As you can see, Gross, who was there at the time and did this drawing at that time, saw it more as a complete breakdown of sanity among his compatriots. But a closer examination forces us to make some important distinctions about the significance of the spirit of August 1914 in different settings, national settings. In France and England, one could say that the nationalist fervor at the outset of the war was to a large extent an emotional reinforcement of what to some extent was an existing reality of national belonging. In Germany, however, the spirit of 1914 was directed much more toward the actual creation of a shared national culture that would overcome internal, regional, and social divisions, liberate innate potentialities, and assert Germany's distinctive individuality as a dominant power in the world. The spirit of 1914 articulated a kind of religious conversion that reunited Germans with their shared inner essence. The enthusiasm of national identification transformed economic, social, and ethnic associations into what Germans like to call a spiritual community, or Gemeinschaft. Defining the war as a war between different communities of subjective identification led to a projection of internal conflicts into the conflict between opposing national cultures. Defining and demonizing the military enemy as the incarnation of another world of meaning that was simply incompatible with one's own, turning war aims into a non-negotiable battle for the life or death of the soul. As a war of national culture grounded in different worlds of meaning, the war also became very much a war of the intellectual classes. Educators, writers, and artists were among the most fervent supporters of the war, often aligning their own subjective identities with the imagined community of the nation in ways that completely disrupted the international intellectual associations of the pre-1914 period. Recent studies have in fact shown that the so-called spirit of 1914 in Germany was essentially carried by the educated middle classes situated in urban centers, university towns, and among youth groups and high schools throughout the country. Some of the most amazing historical documents from the summer and fall of 1914 are statements by intellectuals or images by artists whom one might imagine as cosmopolitan humanists, like Sigmund Freud, Max Weber, Stefan Zweig, Thomas Mann, Rainer Maria Rilke, and even Ludwig Wittgenstein, and to get away from the Germans a bit, Emil Durkheim or Henri Bergson, who fervently identified the world of human culture with their own national culture and often vilified their colleagues and counterparts in other nations as enemies of humanity and culture per se. As two examples, I'd like to go once again to the visual side, and I don't know if any of you know, Ernst Barlach is known primarily as an anti-war artist and as a pacifist and as a person who was degenerate after 1933. And in 1914, his sculptures had this kind of fervency about the national war, right, when he, in August of 1914. And once again, to go back to Otto Dix, who in 1914 and 1915, as he was preparing himself to become an artillery officer and machine gunner, pictured himself in these two poses, the second one as the god of war, Mars, the first one as a kind of decisive and fervent and fiery fighter, indicating, which he also stated in words, his enthusiasm for a kind of cleansing, fiery, and explosive battle that would test the will of he and his fellow Germans. And this is the point where Nietzsche enters the story. In the summer and fall of 1914, Nietzsche emerged from relative countercultural obscurity to become a very public and contentious figure in the national culture wars. On the German side, he was presented as a major spokesperson for the qualities that distinguish German Kultur from French and British civilization or Russian barbarism. Over 200,000 young German volunteers in the late summer and fall of 1914 carried special copies of Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra in their backpacks as they marched into battle. On the French, and especially the only other book that was distributed in that fashion was the Bible. Right? On the French and especially British side, Nietzsche was demonized as the philosopher who had led Germans down the path of the aggressive pursuit of national power, with a total disregard not only for Christian values, but for any universal moral norms. The brutal actions of the German military against civilian populations in the original invasion of Belgium, the bombastic claims about Germany's right to make its own rules in the pursuit of power were widely attributed to Nietzsche's cultural influence. Nietzsche was imagined as a spokesperson for a militaristic, amoral, brutal barbarism that threatened the core values of Western civilization. For today's readers, this emergence of Nietzsche as the battleground of the culture wars of 1914 may all seem somewhat puzzling. Why Nietzsche? Was this choice simply arbitrary, a product of misguided propaganda, or was there something in Nietzsche's writings and cultural stance that opened the door for his widespread, though contradictory, public presence 14 years after his death? We can begin to engage this question by going back to a formative turning point in Nietzsche's own intellectual development. His participation in the wars of German unification in 1866 and 1870, and especially in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 that led directly to the creation of the German nation-state. Nietzsche's expressed loyalties were clearly with Bismarck and Prussia in the wars in which Prussia established its control over Saxony, Bavaria, and other non-Austrian members of the German Confederation. In 1867, at the age of 23, he volunteered with the Prussian field artillery, but this first attempt at national service was cut short by a riding accident that resulted in a broken sternum and a serious chest infection, but did allow him to have himself photographed in his military uniform. In July, it could be a joke. Nobody's quite sure about whether he meant this seriously or whether it was an ironic photograph that he sent to his friends. In 1870, filled with the fear that the vengeful France might destroy the possibilities of German national consolidation, Nietzsche, who had taken on Swiss citizenship as a young classics professor at the University of Basel, asked for leave of absence to join the Prussian army as a volunteer in the medical corps. In his few weeks of service in August 1870, he experienced some of the devastating elements of modern warfare in the Battle of Wörth, in which the heavy use of artillery by the Prussians and the effective use of the new breech-loading rifle by the French produced extremely high casualties in a field littered with both the dead and with wounded bodies moaning for medical attention. Fresh from this battlefield experience during the creation of German political unity, Nietzsche entered the arena of public life with a rhapsodic evocation of the ancient Greek experience of the emergence of cultural identity, of subjective identification, as a model for the new Germany. Nietzsche thus began his public intellectual career as a kind of self-styled prophet of a new national community. Would Germany's military might be matched by cultural power? Would political unity lead to the formation of a spiritual community? The Birth of Tragedy from the Spirit of Music, published in 1872, was a political intervention, a call to release the unconscious energies underlying all specific forms of human existence, mythically embodied in the Greek god Dionysus, and more recently given self-conscious expression in Arthur Schopenhauer's theory of the will, and to sublimate this deep instinctual energy into individuated aesthetic forms like Wagner's music dramas, in which Germans could recognize themselves as members of an authentic cultural community. For Nietzsche in 1872, the German task, as set by Bismarck's wars of political unification, was a conscious recognition of an unconscious identity of national will through revitalized modern forms of ancient Germanic knowledge and myth. Grounding this call for a new cultural order was a sweeping critique of what Nietzsche saw as the dominant characteristics of liberal bourgeois society, politics, and civilization. A world, he thought, in which community was not understood or experienced in terms of subjective identification mediated through mystic art, but as an external unification of separate, atomized individuals through mechanisms of socioeconomic exchange, state regulation, and the homogenizing impact of the pseudoscientific truths of rational humanism. Against this dominant model of Western civilization, Nietzsche set a specifically German tradition of philosophical knowledge that pointed toward the reality of unconscious powers that were beyond the control of analytical reason, and an artistic tradition, especially in literature and music, that gave a distinctive national shape to the primal reality of non-individuated being by means of the long-repressed cultural forms of a Germanic mythology that revealed the authentic German national soul. Now, in the years following the publication of this Wagnerian call for national cultural renewal, Nietzsche rapidly became disillusioned with his youthful dreams of the imminent emergence of a new Germanic culture. By the late 1870s, he had liberated himself from the thrall of Schopenhauer and Wagner and reimagined both of them as individual self-creators who were unaware of the personal, subjective nature of their own intellectual and aesthetic productions. Deceived by their own creations, they fell victim to the illusion that their thought or art was a window into a reality rather than a construction of reality from a very particular perspective. The search for collective identity and nationalist myth was now judged as an ideological escape from the anxiety of meaninglessness. Nationalist ideology in both its cultural and biological racist forms signified for Nietzsche an abdication of the individual task and responsibility to organize unconscious energies into personal form. And this led to a major shift in Nietzsche's view of the cultural functions of philosophy and art. Claims to represent or know objective truths and values beyond the perspectives of individual interpretation simply reinforced passive subordination to the conventional values of the herd. Instead of functioning as a means for self-knowledge, philosophy and art were producers of illusion and mystification. Nietzsche's new joyful science, however, was a science of cultural critique, dedicated to the task of uncovering the relative, interpretive nature of all truth claims. His conception of authentic art was an art dedicated to the self-conscious construction of individual forms of meaning and value, rather than the discovery or representation of objective meaning and value. All of this critical unmasking of the production of value and truth eventually centered on one core issue: the belief in some kind of absolute foundation, center, or origin, God. This transcendent power that held the world together as a world and gave purpose and meaning and therefore a soul or subjective identity to man had gone through a number of metamorphoses and secularizations, most notably for Nietzsche's contemporaries, in the belief in a universal human essence grounded in man's natural species being and in a single progressive history whose purpose was to actualize the full potentialities of this essence, to make humanity real in the world. But belief in any form of objective, universal truth or meaning was simply the last version of religious illusion. Thus, Nietzsche dramatically proclaimed the death of God as the death of all truth and meaning, beyond the perspectival interpretations that historical situated human individuals and societies constructed for themselves. There were two connected implications of this cultural nihilism as Nietzsche understood it. The first was the terrifying vertigo of experiencing a nothingness, an absence, where one once had sought a center or foundation of universal meaning and truth. The second, however, was a liberation of the powers and energies of life that the belief in objective meaning had repressed and denied. The death of objective meaning was also the beginning of life. God died so that the self-creating, life-affirming individual could be born. Now, Nietzsche's joyful science of cultural critique was a stance of emancipation from illusion, of affirmation of one's own creative activity as the only legitimate source of meaning. The process of critical unveiling released the energies that had been inhibited and crushed by attempts to shape individual wills through conformity to collective meaning systems. Such cultural nihilism could be cleansing, purifying experience, a flight into lightness, as Nietzsche liked to say, after the burdensome weight of dependency and conformity. Liberation meant you were no longer a slave, defining yourself with the relationship to some other power, but a master who created his or her own forms of life. Art was not representation of meaning, but the creation of meaning, and thus an ethical and political act, an act of self-construction, an act of giving oneself form. How could one live a purposeful life that shaped itself in an individual fashion in the face of the death of God, the end of history, and the death of man? The task of thinking through the form of a meaningful life after the death of culture runs through Nietzsche's work of the 1880s, but is most prominently articulated for public consumption in his famous work, Thus Spoke Zarathustra. There are three general aspects of this positive message. The first was that the God who had died was displaced by an affirmation of life before meaning, of pure being before any particular beings, as that formless, regenerative energy that Nietzsche called the will to power. All existing beings were individuations of this power, shaped by the struggle among different pulses of energy to give themselves form. But Nietzsche rejected any notion of general purpose in this life energy. There was no goal that was somehow innate to being, no inherent meaning to life. Yet Nietzsche did imagine a hierarchy of types of power in which purely physical power, defined by mastery over others, was sublimated into the reflective spiritual mastery in which life could consciously determine its own process of regeneration and creative expression. It was this spiritualization of power that grounded Nietzsche's second major positive teaching, the displacement of belief in a human essence to which individuals must conform with what he called the overman, or the Übermensch, a concept of human existence as a constant process of redefinition, continually moving beyond any fixed or stable identities, not in order to produce some final end state of humanity, but as an affirmation of the process of recreation itself. The overman gave form to the will to power as spirit, or subjective, purposeful, self-reflexive, creative energy engaged in an endless negative movement beyond any established identities, including that of man. A major problem for Nietzsche, however, was to imagine the form that a community of such overmen might take. How do overmen relate to each other? They cannot allow themselves to be defined by the other, but can they recognize the same lightness of endless negativity in others and envisage a possible community of such self-overcomers? Finally, instead of defining his identity within the movement from past to future in some larger stories scripted by the purposes of God or man, the overman affirmed his process of becoming as always fully in the present, as an affirmation of the now, or what Nietzsche called the eternal recurrence of the same. To love one's fate, Nietzsche's famous phrase, amor fati, was to affirm the constant movement of self-overcoming, without guilt or regret, without nostalgia or hope, turning panic into about the absence of any stable identity into a self-affirming joy. Beginning in the 1880s and then exploding in the 1890s, the decades before the Great War, there appeared a pattern of endlessly variegated diffusion of Nietzsche's thought among different, often antagonistic cultural positions and ideologies. However, this protean potentiality and manifold appropriation of Nietzsche's writings did give expression to a quite specific and pervasive experience of cultural crisis in which all traditional questions of human identity formation were placed into the framework of the collapse of objective meaning and universal truth. At a very basic level, Nietzsche appealed to the experience of all the culturally disinherited, marginalized, alienated individuals for whom the overarching narrative of the death of God, the death of man, and the end of history resonated with existential intensity. Consciousness of the present as a ground zero from which the creation of new truths, meanings, and values would emerge as human, aesthetic constructions and acts of will was particularly pervasive in Germany, but present throughout the world of the culturally alienated, from Ireland to Russia. Nietzsche's cultural nihilism framed the questions and provided a common starting point. Divergencies emerged in the task of turning from destruction to creation, of building a new world and a new man from the collapse of objective meaning. The pervasive impact of Nietzsche's stance of cultural nihilism and renewal was most evident among the visual and literary artists of the European avant-garde. The focal point here was the breakdown of representational art. Visual images and linguistic forms were no longer assumed to be windows into either the world or the self, but the place or the site where both the self and the world were constructed or created. Artistic creation became the model for making worlds with their own spatial and temporal contours, their own objects, subjects, meanings, and truths. At the same time, the breakdown of traditional forms, opened up a vision of the abyss of pure, unformed energy, the Dionysian moment of pure will or life, from which the manifold forms of existence constantly emerged. Many forms of modernist art can be grasped as either the expression of a new constructivist view of vision and speech, in which the art object produces its own world, and a Dionysian primitivist mode in which the unraveling of traditional meanings opened up the unfiltered immediacy of sense experience in the here and now, or the primitive emergence of primal energy and explosion of floating color and shifting fluid forms. Now, these characteristics of the work of the aesthetic avant-garde, for example, are present in many works that I'm sure most of you are familiar with, from Van Gogh to Picasso. Picasso, by the way, also was a Nietzschean during his Cubist period. But I've chosen to show as my example of the collapse of traditional representation two leaders of artists' associations, Die Brücke, or the bridge, quote from Nietzsche's Zarathustra, and the Blaue Reiter, or the Blue Riders, that emerged accompanied by very self-conscious Nietzschean manifestos in the years immediately before the war. In these work by Franz Marc, a leader of the Blue Riders who died on the Western Front in 1916, and Ernst Ludwig Kirchner, a leading member of the Bridge, who suffered a mental breakdown working as a medical orderly on the Western Front in 1915. I won't go into it. It's just to show this incredibly variegated collapse of representational art and these two dimensions of it. One, the sort of Dionysian eruption of this energy into form, and the other, the creation of spaces and forms and objects and so on, which are determined by the boundaries of the work of art, rather than seeing the work of art as a window right into a common world which we all experience. Nietzsche also emerged as a generational component on the fringes of more established oppositional movements of socialists, feminists, and even Zionists, as an age-specific position of the young asserting their commitment to autonomous self-making against the conformism of organized associations. By 1914, this Nietzscheanism of the countercultural left and the young had taken on some of the characteristics of a fad. Nietzsche was imagined as a liberator from the Philistine conventions of bourgeois life, the representative philosopher of individual self-determination against the pressures of state control, social conformity, and religious moralizing, counseling the young, make yourself what you are, not into what others have programmed for you. And of course, Nietzsche still fulfills this role among our college students today, as I can tell you from my Nietzsche class that I teach occasionally. Occurring at the same time, but barely noticeable before 1914, was the gradual growth of an official organized movement in Germany under the care of Nietzsche's sister Elizabeth, who controlled the Nietzsche archive in Weimar after her brother's death and dedicated herself to integrating her brother's legacy into the emerging ideologies of German political and cultural nationalism. Under her editorial censorship and promotional publicity, the official posthumous Nietzsche emerged as a regenerator of national consciousness, of collective self-confidence, strength, autonomy, and toughness, as a genuinely German soul who sought to restore health, power, and vitality to his compatriots. Nietzsche's Zarathustra became, on the one hand, an educator in curing the disease of cultural decadence with military toughness and masculine self-assertion, and thus completely appropriate to be stuffed into the backpacks of young soldiers marching to the front in 1914. And Elizabeth Nietzsche's organization funded a lot of this stuffing of Zarathustra into backpacks, and a visionary prophet of the creation of a self-defining world of German Kultur, no longer inhibited by traditional values and the meanings of Western civilization. This official Nietzsche movement was created in an uphill struggle against the original dominant left-wing Nietzscheanism of the countercultural outsiders. But the spirit of 1914 and the events of the war not only radicalized the official Nietzsche as an ideologue of right-wing political movements, but also gave it an incredible boost, leading ultimately to its domination of the public image of Nietzsche by the end of the war, transforming the proponents of alternative positions into outsiders responding to a new orthodox view. The major perpetrators of this transformation of Nietzsche into a prophet of national regeneration were ideologically committed professors and publicists who self-consciously created the myth of Nietzsche as the prophet of a new kind of cultural order, originating from within the German cultural soul after the collapse of Western civilization and reaching back to archaic Germanic roots in the pre-Christian era. This image of Nietzsche emphasized will to power as a peculiarly German striving for a place in the sun, and typed the overmen as a master race in a quite literal sense that allowed Nietzsche ultimately to be connected to social Darwinism and the eugenics movement. The experience of war transformed the dominant cultural interpretation of Nietzsche in Germany in three basic ways. First of all, it transformed the meaning of nihilism into a very literal demolition of the infrastructure of political and cultural institutions that had supported the illusions of objective truth and meaning. The orgy of death and destruction was interpreted by many German intellectuals, and also some in other national cultures, as an explicit historical actualization of Nietzsche's cultural nihilism, as a kind of fulfillment of that prophecy we read at the beginning. It made the perspective of nihilism into a historical truth, and thus also raised the question of the construction of a new world in a very intense and practical way. What would emerge from the rubble? Second, the war experience pushed the transformation of the meaning of Nietzsche's statements about power and the construction of meaning in a clearly political, collectivist direction. The act of constructing form from the liberated underlying energies of the will to power, so closely wedded to artistic creation and psychological self-fashioning in the culture of modernism before 1914, was increasingly imagined as virtually synonymous with the creation of new forms for the collective national will in the political realm. Finally, the desire to liberate the human will from conformity to collective identities was simply displaced by the search for the new collective identities that would fuse individual wills into one common will. The pre-war notion of trying to leave home and get rid of the old conventions, by 1918, the fervor was driven by the need to have a home and get out of the alienation of being without a home. Each of these transformations was both propelled and taken advantage of by the ideological fervor of the proto-fascist nationalist right, and not only in Germany. Benito Mussolini and Gabriele D'Annunzio, for example, both very fervent Nietzscheans, were prominent representatives of this position in Italy. But today I will examine two famous German exemplars of this transformation of Nietzsche into a prophetic mentor of fascism and National Socialism, Ernst Jünger and Martin Heidegger. Jünger and Heidegger, two of the most prominent intellectuals of 20th century Germany, were both formed in the theoretical matrix of Nietzsche's thought and the experiential matrix of the Great War. Jünger joined up for the war effort while still an underage senior in high school with a sense of liberation from the stifling conventions of what he defined as the age of security, and shared with his generation a yearning for testing himself in the struggles of battle. His intense participation in the front experience continued throughout the war. From the beginning, he kept detailed diaries of his experiences, and immediately after the war, he published the memoir novel Storm of Steel, and also Reflections on War as an Inner Experience, that quickly made him a primary reference point for thinking about the implications of the front experience in the post-war shaping of German politics and culture. For Jünger, the war quickly morphed into a world of experiential immediacy that could only be described as a kind of spectacle which could not be grasped within traditional frameworks of historical purpose or religious meanings. His texts don't interpret a common experience through historical context, but try to ground a new kind of experience in direct observation. Nietzschean nihilism framed his view of the reality of war, which he interpreted as an experiment in creative destruction, demanding hardness, distance, even brutality toward the emotional associations and dependencies of the past. Masculine strength emerged from and was tested by staring into the void without flinching and by affirming fully the energy released in the act of destruction. Two elements were especially striking in Jünger's representation of the war experience. The first was his almost complete identification of the human will with the mechanics and technology of the war machine. The mechanism of modern warfare was not seen as a brutal destruction of the autonomous power of the human will, but as its purest expression. Jünger interpreted Nietzschean will to power as the foundation for a warrior community of the will that found its clearest articulation in a fusion with the machinery of war. Technology was not imagined as simply an instrument of human purpose, but as the ideal collective form of the human will. Humans recognize their own essence as creative destroyers in their identification with the machine. Just as striking as this affirmation of modern technology as the disciplining form of the underlying energies of human existence was Junger's almost mystical or religious consciousness of the complete immersion of the individual in the collective will during these acts of destruction. And here's a characteristic quote. The battle of the machines is so colossal that man almost completely disappears before it. Often already caught in the force fields of the modern battlefield, it seemed so strange and scarcely believable that I was witnessing world historical events. Combat took on the form of a gigantic, lifeless mechanism and swept an icy, impersonal wave across the ground. It was like the cratered landscape of a dead star, lifeless and radiating heat. And yet, behind all this is man. Only he gives the machines their direction and their meaning. It is he that spits from their mouths bullets, explosives, poisons. He that elevates himself in them like birds of prey above the enemy. He that sits in their stomach as they stalk the battlefield, spewing fire. It is he, the most dangerous, bloodthirsty, and purposeful being that the earth has to carry. In the late 1920s and early 1930s, Junger tried in a number of essays and books to expand his conception of the essential content of the Friend experience to society at large as a model for the creation of an authentic German national culture. In his 1932 book, The Worker, he envisioned a total mobilization of human energies in an organized activity of production, merging the machine with the human body in a collective Nietzschean process of constant production of forms that could serve as a new model for cultural identity. Community was the result of an aesthetic act of constructing form from the liberated energies of life, publicly best represented by aesthetic spectacle and militarized totality, rather than the laws of institutions regulating the interaction of separate individuals. Energy mobilized in the achievement of form was not directed toward any particular purpose other than self-expression of its own power. It is important to note that Junger distanced himself from the National Socialist ideology and party in a number of ways, rejecting the reductive definition of will to power in terms of racial biology. And also after 1932, he increasingly emphasized the dynamics of self-creation as a process that was never complete and always open to the future, to the point where a religious and mythical dimension of the never fully formed energies of life became a prominent theme in his later works. Some of you may know that he collaborated with Mircea Eliade in the post-World War II period. Martin Heidegger, however, claimed that Junger's early 1920s productions defined him as the only true, authentic heir of Nietzsche in the post-war era. Heidegger is the major German representative of an existentialist philosophy based on the Nietzschean foundation of nihilism. There's a cross under Heidegger there in that picture, right? On the collapse of objective meaning. In the mid-1920s, he also became the most important philosophical mentor of the German war generation as a charismatic, mesmerizing teacher who transformed the abstractions of philosophy into what seemed to be a vital activity of self-formation and ethical practice. For many members of the war generation attending his lectures and reading his writings, Heidegger seemed to open up the question of living purposefully in a world without meaning, of how the experienced despair of an existence hovering over the abyss of nothingness might be grasped as a possibility for new beginnings. Now, Heidegger's philosophy is not usually connected to the experience of World War I. Unlike Junger and most men of his generation, he succeeded in avoiding frontline service for the whole 4 years of the war, an incredibly unusual event in the German side. However, recently discovered evidence has suggested that Heidegger's philosophy was very much framed by the war and by his feelings of guilt at not placing his life on the line with other members of his generation. Like Junger, in the act of willing with others for the salvation and flourishing of the German national community. In the early 1930s, Heidegger's previously veiled public motivations became clearer as he supported the triumph of the National Socialist Party and accepted a position of authority under the new regime as a rector of Freiburg University. In a number of notorious speeches in his new official capacity, he counseled his colleagues and students to recognize their shared situation of inherited conditions, blood and soil, and engage in a common resolve that would create a powerful national community in which freedom was synonymous with obedience to the call of the leader, a call that articulated the voice of inner conscience that should arouse them from forgetfulness and remind them of their shared origins and purposes. Such German resolve, he said, he interpreted as a choice for the collective ownership of our historical destiny, a communal version of Nietzsche's amor fati, or love of one's fate. Now, in many ways, Heidegger's conception of this community of subjective identification and national resolve was closer to the spirit of 1914 than to Junger's warrior fraternity of front soldiers who were united in the activity of defying death to sustain the ongoing power of life to achieve new forms. Heidegger's desire to politicize and collectivize Nietzsche's will to power through taking up and completing the resolve expressed in the spirit of 1914 was most obvious in a speech he gave to his high school graduating class on their 25th reunion in 1934, a reunion which he redefined as the 20th anniversary of the spirit of 1914. He tried to rally his generational cohort to take up the spirit of 1914 in order to finish their task, continue the war, and complete the spiritual triumph of the German will. The Great War was not the war to end all wars, but the first act of an unfinished war for world cultural power. In fact, in this speech, Heidegger may have been one of the first persons to designate the Great War as the First World War. And these are two short excerpts from that speech. The Great War becomes today for us Germans, for us first and foremost among all peoples, the historical actuality of our existence for the first time. For history is not that which has been, nor even what presents itself, but rather what is to come, and our task with respect to it. The question to be decided is, which nation possesses the inner strength to grow towards the great test that now for the first time has emerged and becomes manifest? It is the question to the nations about the originality of their national arrangements, about the rank and legitimacy of their will to lead, about the cohesion of their spiritual world, about the health of their national life force, about their strength to withstand this historical disaster. Heidegger, of course, eventually became, or claimed to become, disillusioned with the Nazis as well. Like Junger, he later judged their attempt to ground German spirit and culture in racial biology as a vulgar scientism. For both Junger and Heidegger, the goal had been a miraculous, magical emergence of subjective or spiritual identity, Junger building on the model of total mobilization in war and the fraternity of front soldiers, Heidegger returning to the collective, subjective resolve by Germans in 1914 to give actuality to their spiritual being. But the somewhat tepid intermigration of Junger and Heidegger in the 1930s did not halt the historical momentum of the collectivization and politicization of Nietzsche's thought that had carried their own thinking forward in the post-war era. There were many vulgar Nietzscheans ready to take their place as ideologues of the National Socialist regime, and Nietzsche rapidly became its official philosopher. Hitler himself expressed personal indifference to Nietzsche, but was willing to accommodate his own followers' Nietzscheanism, and of course willingly posed for this official portrait at the Nietzsche archive in Weimar. He also sent Mussolini the complete works of Nietzsche for his birthday, among other things. But Nietzsche was a primary inspiration of Nazi ideologues and administrators, and those in charge of the educational system and popular propaganda continued to make Nietzsche speak in National Socialist jargon, to present him as a thinker whose thoughts had become deeds in the Nazi regime. One such ideologue, Alfred Bäumler, even claimed that when we call Heil Hitler to our youth, we are also greeting them with Heil Nietzsche. In both academic and popular settings, Nietzsche became the official philosopher of the Third Reich. His phrases were repeated constantly and everywhere. Will to power and the overman were the framing concepts of virtually all discussions of ethics and politics, used ideologically in a very literal fashion to refer to Aryan racial politics and imperialist ambitions. And sustaining the Nazis to the very end was the belief that even in apparent defeat, they were the historical instruments for the total destruction of the old world, a necessary act before their vision of a new world could emerge. As Berlin was turned into rubble in the spring of 1945, Joseph Goebbels claimed, "Together with the monuments of culture, there crumble also the last obstacles to the fulfillment of our revolutionary task. Now that everything is in ruins, we are forced to rebuild Europe. In the past, private possessions tied us to bourgeois restraint. Now the bombs, instead of killing all Europeans, have only smashed the prison walls which have held them captive. In trying to destroy Europe's future, the enemy has succeeded in smashing its past, and with that, everything old and outworn is gone. Now, I do not intend to let Joseph Goebbels have the last word, even if my time is beginning to run out. I still have a few minutes. I thought I would conclude with a brief description of the alternative path taken by three well-known Central European writers who struggled to produce both ironic and hopeful narratives of the human quest for meaning within the Nietzschean frame of the death of God, the death of man, and the end of history in the years immediately after the Great War. All three had struggled with what we might call the liberating dimension of Nietzschean nihilism in the pre-war period, examining in their fictional work both the issue of meaning construction in the quest for identity and the affirmation of unconscious life forces released by the collapse of traditional meanings. All in different ways had initially greeted the spirit of 1914 as opening the possibility for constructing a meaningful cultural community, a home for the disinherited subject. But the war forced a renewed examination and a taking stock of the nature of the human subject in a world without meaning. It also forced a reconsideration of the problematic elements in the unconscious life forces that Nietzsche had described under the general term of the will to power, and especially of the dark side of the unconscious life energies that emerge in the irrational rage to destroy oneself and others in the absolutist identity politics of the war and the post-war period. In a pamphlet published anonymously in 1919, Hesse portrayed the message of Zarathustra as both a therapeutic support for honestly facing and managing the dark side of the unconscious life instincts, and a guide for resisting ideological escapes into new forms of closed identities. Zarathustra returned to speak to the war generation about the need to control and affirm oneself in a constant process of self-overcoming as an individual before ever even thinking about entering into group identifications. But he didn't really go beyond that to talk about another way of thinking about social interaction. Musil and Mann, in wide-ranging fictional examinations of the European cultural world on the verge of the Great War, their novels were both set in 1914 and 1913, and the problem of constructing a meaningful identity within it also focused with new intensity on the seductions of identity politics that had emerged so strongly in the culture and ideological conflicts of the war, and which they themselves had become at least temporarily enmeshed. Unlike Hesse, however, their main focus was on thinking through the possibility that Nietzsche's notion of the overman as an endless overcoming of stable identities might function as the basis for new forms of social interaction and mutual recognition in an association one might even call a community. Could human beings find a meaning or home in this inner lack of identity, in the constant sense of possibility and contingency? And could one recognize this possibility, which was both prior to and constantly moving beyond any particular identity, in other people as well? And could such recognition form the basis of a more general mutual recognition and human association? Could this indeterminacy of the subject be affirmed and experienced in others in acts of mutual recognition and even love? Was there a kind of higher, even divine love expressed in the mutual recognition of this mirror of possibility? A love that was not driven by the desire for possession and which was universal in the sense that it transcended all forms of recognition through common identities, seeing the other instead as a constant possibility of identities that were imaginable for everyone. As an empty space, a negativity, an indeterminate possibility. That should be at the end of the sentence. As a negative, as an empty space, a negativity, an indeterminate possibility. The central characters of Musil and Mann's novels, Ulrich, the man without qualities, and life's innocent child Hans Castorp, traveled on journeys of personal identity exploration, construction, and experimentation that constantly moved beyond any particular identity and investigated all of the psychological motives and social pressures that fueled the intense desire to believe in a particular imagined community. For both Musil and Mann, the possibility of imagining the world of cultural death as a world of opportunity for cultural life was grounded in a personal choice to act beyond the existing identities presented by the ideological preachers and doctors of the cultural establishment. This choice is sustained by a vision in which the ability to affirm difference as the ground of self-affirmation is tied to what can only be called or what they could only call the divinity in all humans, a new universal humanism. As in Musil's unfinished magnum opus, Mann tied the possibility of affirming human subjectivity in self and others to the emergence of a form of non-possessive love characterized by mutual recognition of the divine nothingness of infinite possibility that transcends all specific identities, a love that can resist the forces of death and in which both the woe and the joy of constant self-creation and affirmation is sustained by recognition in the face of the other. This vision of human existence transcending identity remains a possible way of connecting ethically to a choice of identity in which we may recognize our own historical possibilities and responsibilities. And as Nietzsche himself suggested on a number of occasions, the mutual recognition of all of men who see in each other the indeterminacy of possibility rather than the determinacy of specific identities is not temporally defined and includes the dead. In this sense, cultural death can open up the possibility of a cultural life of mutual recognition that includes not only the living, but also the dead. Now, that really is radical hope.
Congratulations. Great. Come up here. Thank you, Professor Toews, for that very rich and enlightening talk. We're going to take a few minutes to collect some questions from the audience. And while we're doing that, I have a question for you, John. I was thinking about all the really interesting visual images in your talk, the images of modernist paintings. And I was wondering if there's a connection between the intellectual transformations that you're tracing in your talk and some of those visual images.
Well, as you know, visual art is not my forte. When I do enter into the arts in my classes, I usually go the musical route or the literary route. But I found in this topic, as I was pursuing this topic, Nietzsche's position about human beings as really the creation of form, as constructivist, as a transformation of energy into form, which is very problematic as a political model, but which is very dominant in Heidegger and Junger and people like that, is all based on this sort of aesthetic politics, the notion of of politics as a form of art, which shows itself in spectacle, so that the way in which people recognize themselves as members of a political community is through parades and spectacular productions of some sort or another. And that the politicians see the actual creation of the political community as a kind of creation of a unified form out of these collective energies. So that the visual, there are a lot of paradoxes in this. I mean, one of the things that I find very interesting is that all those modernist artists, who took up Nietzsche and who pushed this element so strongly wound up in the degenerate art exhibit, from Otto Dix, Max Beckmann, the people from the Bridge, the people from the Blue Riders, they were all, and you see that bust of Nietzsche. It seems, for a regime that took Nietzsche as their official philosopher, you think they could stomach, but it seemed too intense for them. It was a bust of Nietzsche, which was not the bust of the kind of philosophical patriarch that they wanted, and so in fact that bust was destroyed and is no longer extant as far as we know. Although in Berlin they keep finding stuff all the time, underground. Have any of you been to the Neues Museum? Where they put a lot of the stuff that they dug up while they were digging up the subway lines and stuff like that. So a lot of that art didn't actually disappear, but it seemed to have disappeared, and I haven't heard anything about that bust. Anyway, right. So does that answer the question? Probably not.
Yes, thank you. Some interesting questions here. One question is, how was Nietzsche received and perceived by ordinary Germans? not just by some of the intellectuals and artists you mentioned, but what about
Well, you know,
ordinary
I think
Germans?
that's a good question because, you know, one of the things that I have to deal with in this is the way in which both in 1914 and the post-1918 period is driven by these intellectual classes. And I think there's a social class reason for it, that one of the reasons that the intellectual classes are so fervent in producing this notion of the great politics of culture is because they saw themselves in the period before 1914 as losing their status in German society to business people, government bureaucrats, corporate types, and so on. And so they grabbed on this notion of cultural politics in a really intense fashion. Now, I think, you know, if you've seen the film All Quiet on the Western Front, I think that you know that it's popular in the sense that if you're going to a gymnasium, to a high school, and that you'll get this ideology pumped into you. If you're a member of a youth group in Nazi Germany, you'll get this ideology pumped into you, and you'll in fact have people like Alfred Bäumler telling students to say Heil Nietzsche when they say Heil Hitler. You know, it's like the two things are synonymous in some way. But whether, you know, if you're a farmer, or whether if you're an artisan, or if you're a factory worker, you would have ever thought. I mean, there are some wonderful stories in other countries, like in England, where you may have people attacked bookstores looking for somebody called Nietzsche, who was supposed to be the person who had perpetrated all these atrocities in Belgium and so on. And some of you may also know that H.L. Mencken, the American translator of Nietzsche and so on, was actually arrested through popular pressure and kept incarcerated for a few months in 1916 when the U.S. entered the war because he was a Nietzschean, and that was the same as being, you know, a kind of German nationalist. So it's spread in the public domain. I mean, if you look at the Völkischer Beobachter, for example, in Germany, the popular magazine that, you know, I don't know who all reads the popular magazines, but Nietzsche is everywhere in that. I mean, people have done sort of studies in which he appears on every page of the Völkischer Beobachter, which is a sort of national enquirer of Nazi Germany. Well, maybe that's the wrong thing. I don't know.
Great. So another interesting question from the audience asks you to talk about another different element of Nietzsche's work, which is the later part of his work that contains anti-national and anti-German passages, and wonders how this aspect of the philosopher's thought was pushed aside.
Yeah, I mean, I tried to say that after his Birth of Tragedy book, you know, he turns completely around, and he sees nationalism as an ideological, you know, a problematic surrender of your responsibility to act in terms of your own self-creation and so on. And his later writings are full of, you know, phrases and so on, which he makes fun of German nationality. You know, he talks about the new Europe in terms of the good Europeans, in which the Jewish population plays a major role, and all these kinds of things. And one of the things about the official Nietzsche, also the official Nietzsche publications and republications of his works, is that they were really severely edited by his sister. His sister, by the way, has a long history. She engaged in nationalist racist politics with her first husband, tried to establish a colony in Paraguay, which was completely pure, genetically German. Some of you may have seen articles in the New York Times in the last 10 years in which they've now investigated this group, and they're all completely mentally disabled because they, in fact, inbred for 100 years. So it was a kind of a cautionary tale about racial politics. But so she was an intense German nationalist in the kind of worst, you know, racial sense, and she had control of the official publications. So, you know, there was some, you know, she didn't completely rewrite them, but she edited out a lot of the things which were might not fit into that ideology. And I should say also, there were people all the way through World War I, through the 20s, through the National Socialist period, who thought that Nietzsche was a bad choice as the official Nazi philosopher, because they knew about those passages, and they said, this is crap. We're making this guy into the official philosopher where he deserves to be with those degenerate artists, and so that division remained in Germany. So there were people who opposed Nietzsche's, rise to power, shall we say.
So we have a couple of questions that ask in different ways about propaganda and the use of propaganda, Nietzsche's image in German propaganda. So one question asks, how important do you think Nietzschean concepts were to Goebbels' propaganda of the Nazi Party?
I've just thought of this recently. I think you brought up propaganda, didn't you? Yeah. And World War I is the place where official government propaganda emerges as this huge industry, right? And the book that I read when I was an undergraduate by Harold Lasswell about the beginnings of propaganda comes out of that in the 1920s. And so I thought of it in terms of the collectivization of Nietzsche's notion of the construction of truth and value, right? So that if Nietzsche really really tries to show that we are responsible for the meanings and truths around which we shape our lives and so on, right? They're not objective, right? They're not universal out there that we have something that we have to conform to. I mean, if you turn that into a kind of official machine for national purposes, it's propaganda. Now, I think people have always written narratives in order to give form to their own positions and so on. And people who do histories of propaganda go back, to the Roman Empire and things like that. And I think, some places where there is really cultural politics on a high scale, like in the German Reformation, places like that, propaganda is incredible, right? In terms of propaganda that looks just like World War I propaganda. If you have the British showing Germans hacking off the hands of little babies, in the Reformation period, you have the same thing with Catholics and Protestants, but these images of the barbaric acts of the other side. But I mean, I think it is interesting. So at the point at which there's a sort of a breakdown in at least the sort of general human assumption that there is a kind of common framework, right, and that somehow the stories that we tell, can't be completely incommensurable with something that the Germans might be able to read as well, or the French and so on. That World War I really smashes that up. I mean, this sort of national definition of culture really smashes that apart. So why shouldn't Britain or France write their own version? I mean, there's a theory that the war could have ended in 1916 or 1917. There were people who, seriously, after Verdun, I think, you probably know more about this than I do, but that the propaganda machines had created such a reality that it was simply impossible for the people doing the negotiations to even try to convince people that a negotiated peace had any sense, because everybody was convinced that it was a kind of successful exterminationist war going on from both sides. So that way, the propaganda became a reality in World War I in ways which was really disturbing. I guess it's a good word.
Agreed. I wanted to ask you about the part of your talk that deals with Heidegger and how you make Heidegger's thought an important link between the story you're telling in 1914 and where you end up in 1933. Mm-hmm. How is he a connection between those two parts of the story?
Yeah, I mean, I teach Heidegger with a fairly apolitical format in some of my classes, and I think I find myself trying to think my way back into 1925, 26, and Karl Loveth, Herbert Marcuse, Hannah Arendt, all of these intellectuals whom we would certainly not associate with German nationalism or certainly National Socialism, right, were Heidegger's star students, right? Marcuse was his TA. Hannah Arendt, as probably many of you know, was his lover. And to imagine that they could have been taken in by Heidegger in this way when what was implicit in Heidegger, in fact, the reality which came out in 33 and 34. I think there is a way in which you can talk about the phenomenology of the thing that drew, they thought that finally a philosopher was, we read Heidegger, it's just like a bunch of abstractions, German abstractions, right? But they read Heidegger as if he was talking about the reality of lived existence, and how they could recreate purpose in their own personal lives from the ground up, in a way. And so they admired Heidegger as this kind of personal, guru kind of charismatic teacher. And so, and none of that had anything to do with politics or with, German nationalism or anything like that for most of these people. And so many of them were incredibly hurt and shocked by what happened in 1933 and 1934. So, I think, there's a big controversy about this, about, whether Heidegger's decisions in 1933 and 1934 expressed something really foundational about his kind of existential philosophy, that it's there from the beginning, it's really built into it. And then you'd have to say that all of these other people were just self-deceived undergraduates who had no idea what was really being told them from the podium, right? But I think it's more complicated than that. And I think that the intensity with which, this is an audience which probably remembers Herbert Marcuse, right? For the Angela Davis's thesis advisor, the head of the SDS in the United States and so on. To imagine him, and actually in World War II, he worked with the OSS, right? He was like to imagine him as being sort of taken in by a neo-Nazi or a proto-Nazi seems very hard to believe, right? And both Hannah Arendt and Herbert Marcuse used Heideggerian starting points to then develop their own rather different political positions. So I guess I'm not clear about, his place in this. But this speech that he made to his high school graduating class in 1934 is just discovered 5 years ago and hasn't yet entered into all these debates. And what I found really interesting in it was it's tied to 1914, right? And the way he imagined himself as continuing the spirit of 1914. And in fact, in that speech, he actually says, he calls the Great War the First World War. And I really think that he might be the first major thinker to actually say that. So that he was already thinking about World War II as a continuation, even 5 years before it began. If you look in Wikipedia, it'll say, when did people start saying World War II? And they say usually 1940s. Sort of a year or two after it had started, people said, oh, this is another World War, it's World War II. So, but Heidegger had, he said it in 1934, which is fascinating in a way that I could sort of, when I read this thing, it's only about 5 pages long, the speech, and I sort of couldn't get away from it because it seemed to reveal a lot of things about his thinking that I hadn't really thought about before.
And of course, we have no self-deceiving undergraduates at the University of Washington, so never happen here.
By the way, I didn't want to make fun of the sophomoric Nietzscheanism, because I remember, actually I was still in high school when one of my teachers gave me a book by Nietzsche. And it is as a personal thing, when you're trying to break away from your parents and the conventions of the herd and the Philistines that are trying to force you into taking up a career that's going to, provide everybody with proper esteem except you, that Nietzsche really appeals to that, and it did already in the 19th century. It has a long history. And maybe that's the place where it should have stayed. There's a way, that whole, Hannah Arendt found this out right after she broke away from Heidegger, but there's a very problematic political model which is tied into this notion of giving form to this collective energy. That somehow it's not about creating institutions of interaction, right, and so on. It's about providing an aesthetic form, gestalt, making forms for, out of human labor, human energy, and so on. And it's a completely totalitarian or totalizing model of politics. It doesn't leave any room for, a serious room for the recognition of difference. So, and that's, Nietzsche acts as if great politics, cultural politics, is politics. And Heidegger and Jünger do the same thing. It's a terrible model. Hannah Arendt, you should read Hannah Arendt's critique of them. She got it right.
Well, maybe that's a perfect place to end, is
Right.
with critique. Let's thank Professor Toews for this very interesting talk.